My name is Major Martin Robinson Delany. I am the highest ranking colored officer during the Civil War, commissioned by President Lincoln himself. My life and my story starts way before I became a commissioned officer in the United States Colored Troops. When I was young, my father was a slave and my mother was free. I had an encounter of watching my father almost killed because he came home during the holidays off the plantation, and my mother wanted him to stay, and of course us kids wanted him to stay, but his owner needed him back on the plantation. His owner requested twice, and my father stayed. Then he sent the sheriff out to my father to arrest my father and bring him back. And then an encounter ensued with the sheriff, and my father ripped the clothes of the sheriff off and a couple of other men that tried to help him take my father into custody. At that time, my father's owner showed up and said he's too expensive to replace. And he put his hand on the sheriff's arm and pushed the barrel down. At that point in time, the sheriff picked up a nice rock. My father had taken the sling blade off the wagon and was climbing a fence to protect himself. And at that time, the sheriff took that rock and squarely hit my father in the face, knocking him to the ground and splitting his face wide open. They took my father into custody, back to the plantation. That was one of my first horrors of slavery that I witnessed, especially with my own father. Then later on in life, I witnessed something else that was more tragic. I was born in West Virginia, which was Virginia at the point in the time, Charlestown. I learned how to read and write from a northern carpetbagger who would come down to the town where my mother had her little shop at. My mother was a seamstress, and as she would go into town, we would be outside playing and doing our chores and stuff, and the carpetbagger said that everyone had a right to learn how to read and write. So he would take us into my mother's house, and he would teach us how to read and write. Well, myself and my two other siblings, didn't know we were young, and one day we were outside playing, and we were playing school, and somebody noticed, and they went to the local authorities. A gentleman came up and asked who we were, asked our names, asked who our parents were. We told him. He said he was satisfied and left. Later on that evening, when my mother was coming home, just like always, we'd run to her. She'd be happy to see us. We'd be happy to see her. And she would gather us up in her arms and ask us how our day was. Well, my brother said, "Mom, we had a visitor today," and he was asking what our names were and asking what you and Dad's names were. And that happiness that a mother always has when she's around her children and sees her children, I could see it turn to something that was more ominous and more worrying. And she asked, what was it about? And we told her. At that point in time, she knew that her family was getting ready to be sold into slavery. Because in the South, if you were able to read and write as a black person, you were sold immediately. And the family split up because it was against the law. So at that point in time, my mother gathered us up and she hiked us from Charlestown, West Virginia, up to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and she didn't stop until she knew she was on free ground. Later on, 2 years later, after my father was able to obtain his freedom by buying it, and he joined my mother and the rest of the family here in Chambersburg. I toiled around in Chambersburg for about 10 years. And then I walked out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to a all-colored school. I was introduced to a gentleman out there who took me under his wing. And he asked me what I wanted to be, and I told him I'd like to be a doctor. So he started teaching me medicine, cupping and leeching, the old traditional methods. He said, Martin, he said, I've taught you all I can. He said, there's more that you can do. He says, but I'm not the man to teach you. You need further medical schooling. But while I was in Pittsburgh, I heard people talking about slavery. They were abolitionists. And that memory of my father being brought to the ground by that rock to his face and not being able to see him every day, and he'd only get a pass on the weekends or on the holidays to come see his family, that kept the burning in me. So I started attending more abolitionist rallies. At one point in time, I met Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass and myself became good friends. Actually, Frederick Douglass and myself started a paper called the North Star. And Frederick knew of me because I had a paper called The Mystery. It's a small paper for blacks and anybody else who wanted to read them. Frederick and I formed a great bondship. But Frederick and I decided to part ways because we had a little difference of opinion of how our people should form and grow into society in the States. So we parted ways. We still remain friends. We still were close. Matter of fact, Frederick, once I was talking years afterward, and Frederick actually said that I think Martin is glad that he's a man, but more than ever, Martin's glad that he's a black man. And I took that with great pride. From there, I actually went up to Harvard Medical School. Myself and two other black gentlemen were the first 3 black gentlemen ever to walk in the hallowed grounds of Harvard Medical School. I was going to continue my medical education, but I wasn't permitted to because my classmates went to the dean and said that we don't mind them being here, we just mind them here while we're here. So after our first year, we were asked to leave. At that point in time, I joined another doctor who took me under his wing, and we got my papers and we went into the South. Well, we were asked to come to a plantation, and on that plantation, there was a gentleman who particularly didn't like us or what we stood for because the doctor was also anti-slavery. We were asked to come to the plantation. We did. Of course, I was asked to go around the back while the doctor was escorted through the house out to the back veranda. And back on the back veranda, the overseer and the plantation owner were there drinking cool lemonade. And the plantation owner said, I understand you don't like our ways of living down here, especially owning Negroes. And the doctor just nodded his head yes. And they looked over at me. And the doctor immediately says he has his free papers. He's with me. And at that point in time, the overseer says, Patty, calls Patty out. Patty comes out of the house. She says, go get me Lucius. Patty runs to get Lucius. The overseer says to the owner of the plantation, we will show them that what property is. At that point in time, Lucius showed up. What I'll remember about Lucius is he had a terrible overbite. Lucius was, I'd say, a child about 11, 10, maybe even 12 at the most. And the overseer told Patty to fetch his whip, which he had a name for, Nellie, which we didn't know. We thought somebody else was coming named Nellie, but when Patty came back, Patty had a whip. And he looked us square in the eye and he said, their property, no more or less than an animal, their property. At that point in time, he told Lucius to come. But what Lucius didn't know was his days of playing with the owner's son and his days of feeding the chickens and helping with dishes and gathering eggs has come to an end. It was time for Lucius to hit the fields. But in that time also, Lucius had to know and learn who was boss. Lucius knew what was coming because he had seen it before. The overseer says, Lucius, come here. And Lucius said, I'll be good. I'll be good. I'll be good. And the overseer said, as he looked at us and he said, I'll make him dance. I'll make him sing like a spring bird. And I'll make him cry like a baby. Only when I tell him to. At that point in time, he told Lucius to get down on all fours, take his shirt off. And he said, I'll make him bark like a dog and howl like one too. At that point in time, he told Lucius to start making a circle around him. Lucius had already started crying because he knew what was coming. About the second time around, after the overseer talking about property and such, he hit Lucius got right in front of him. And the first lash of the whip hit his skin. And he said, don't you cry. Don't you yell. And Lucius had to suck it up. And he said, keep moving. And Lucius kept walking around, kept crawling around him. Second time around, he hit him again. And Lucius, you could see the pain. The third time around, he hit him again, and the welts opened up. And you could see the blood, that crimson blood that we all have, started to run off his back. And he said, they're property, no less than an animal. He was done. Lucius crawled off, whimpering. Patty, get him some salve and take him back. Patty gathered him up, got him some salve, took him back. I'd never seen him again. Don't know what happened to him. But the overseer looked at us and said, they're just like property, and that's all they are. No less than our hogs in the hog pen, no less than our cattle in the barn, no less than the chickens walking around the plantation. They're property. We were escorted off the plantation, and myself and the doctor, we concluded our stay in the South for the reasons why we were there, and we were back in the North. Those incidents burned in me, and I really, really, really wanted to help our people, me being free and them not. I went to the Civil War had broken out. And I had a plan. The plan was to meet with President Lincoln and give him an idea how to end the war faster. So I went into the mansion and he was sitting there and he was doing paperwork and he says, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Sir," and he said, "Wait a minute. There was a lady that really needed to see him and he could hear her out in the hall." Well, at that time, anybody could see the President of the United States. And he let her in. She stated her case. Well, somebody stole the poor lady's chickens and she wanted the president to do something about it. He told her he would look into it. So we got back to business. And he says, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Sir, it's not what you can do for me, it's what I can do for you." At that point in time, he took his glasses down, slid them down his nose, and he looked up at me and he said, "Continue." I said, "Sir, I have an idea of how to bring this war to an end closer and also help my people." And he said, "Continue." I said, "The USCT troops," I said, "they're not led by any black officers." I said, "I propose to raise USCT troops by taking them off the plantations." I said, "But a black officer riding onto a plantation would inspire those slaves to follow." And he said, "That's a great idea." And he sat back and we were talking. And we got off the subject a little bit and we talked about the Underground Railroad and so forth and so on, and how that helped the war immensely by giving information, spies. And he said, "Who will lead these troops, the black troops?" And I said, "There's plenty of good black men out there, sir, that will do that." He put his head down. And at that point in time, I was going to say, "Sir, I do have some letters of introduction here." And I gave them to him. He says, "Martin Delany, oh, I know who you are. I've read your newspaper in Frederick's newspaper, the North Star." He said, "I don't need any more introduction than this." He said, after he thought a while, he said, "You will lead these troops." And I said, "Sir," I said, "I have no military background." And he said, "Half my generals don't." Appointed. And I said, "I understand." And we talked a few more minutes. And at one point in time, he gave me a card. And he said, to Secretary Stanton of War, and on that card it said, "Do not fail to have a meeting with this intelligent black man." And at that point in time, he said, "Give this to Secretary Stanton, and we will go from there." I gave the card to Secretary Stanton. I went into the mansion, the White House, as a free black man and a civilian. And I walked out a major, the highest ranking colored officer, rank and field, the Civil War. My proposal was to go on to those plantations with black troops and a black officer and draw those slaves off those plantations, which would cripple the Confederacy, because at that point in time, the slaves were almost pretty much the backbone of the Confederacy. This was in '65. They cooked, they butchered, they gardened, they planted, they harvested, they did just about everything. They drove the wagons, they did just about everything. Built the wagons, they were carpenters, they did everything. And if I could take those slaves off those plantations and cripple them, cripple the Confederacy, just might end the Civil War a little more. And that's what President Lincoln liked, and that's why he said, "You will do it." So that's what I did. I went to Beaufort, South Carolina. I raised the 104th United States Colored Troops, raised partial 105th United States Colored Troops. But the whole fruition came to an end because on April 14th, some bad news reached my ears. I was walking down the street in Beaufort, and my corporal came running up to me, "Sir, sir, sir, he is dead, he is dead." And I'm turning around, "Who is dead?" And he said, "The president." And I said, "This is no time to be making fun or light, Jones, sir." He said, "No, sir. Telegraph office, the president has been shot." At that point in time, my whole body and whole soul and being just drained out of me. Because at that point in time, I felt that our hope as a people had just run out. I didn't know how to feel. I didn't know how to tell. I didn't know what to say to my troops. I didn't know what to say to the civilians who seen hope and light. But at that point in time, despair was very, very hard and very, very real. But we've pledged on, or we forged on, and after the war, I got moved to the 52nd United States Colored Troops, and I became associated with the Freedmen's Association. And that was the Freedmen Association was the go-to between the planters and the slaves, because now the planters needed manpower and the slaves, ex-slaves, needed work. So we were the go-between between the two to make everybody happy. And that is my story. Major Martin Robinson Delany, 104th United States Colored Troops.